To understand what happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath, we need to start with something fundamental that often gets overlooked in psychological discussions of these relationships. We're not just talking about the loss of a person or even the loss of narcissistic supply. We're talking about the loss of the narcissist's only real connection to the divine, to the transcendent, to the spiritual dimension of human existence. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it gets to something essential about how the narcissist actually experiences spiritual reality. The narcissist, by the very nature of their pathology, is cut off from direct spiritual experience. Their entire psychological structure is organized around defending against vulnerability, maintaining grandiosity, and avoiding authentic feeling. But genuine spiritual experience, connection to something greater than the ego, moments of transcendence, the felt sense of love as a universal force. All of this requires exactly what the narcissist cannot allow: surrender of the defended self, openness to being transformed by something beyond their control, willingness to experience awe and smallness in the face of mystery. So the narcissist exists in a kind of spiritual desert. They're disconnected from the numinous, from the sacred, from those moments of grace and beauty and meaning that make human life feel spiritually significant. They might perform religious or spiritual identity, attending services, speaking spiritual language, even holding positions of spiritual authority, but there's no genuine inner experience underneath the performance. It's all part of the grandiose presentation, the curated image, another arena for demonstrating superiority. But then the empath enters their life, and the empath brings something the narcissist cannot generate themselves: a living, embodied connection to spiritual depth. The empath has the capacity for genuine love, not as a transaction or a performance, but as a state of being, an openness of heart that connects them to something larger than themselves. They can experience beauty and be moved by it. They can feel compassion and let it transform them. They can access transcendence through art, nature, connection, suffering. They're spiritually alive in a way the narcissist simply is not. And in the empath's presence, the narcissist can experience these spiritual dimensions secondhand. They can witness love through the empath's capacity for it. They can touch transcendence through the empath's ability to access it. They can feel something approaching spiritual depth through proximity to someone who genuinely embodies it. The empath becomes, in essence, the narcissist's intermediary to the divine, not in some grandiose religious sense, but in the simple, profound sense that the empath provides access to spiritual experiences and dimensions of being that the narcissist cannot reach directly. Think about what this looks like in practice. The empath brings the narcissist to a beautiful natural setting and feels genuine wonder, genuine reverence for the sacred quality of what they're witnessing. The narcissist doesn't feel this directly. They can't. Their defenses prevent it. But in observing the empath's genuine response, they can approximate the experience. They can say, "Yes, this is beautiful," and almost believe it, because the empath's authentic feeling creates a kind of contact high. Or the empath loves the narcissist with a quality of unconditional acceptance that touches something divine, the ability to see someone fully and love them anyway. The narcissist can't generate this kind of love themselves, can't even fully receive it without their defenses interfering, but they can experience it peripherally through the empath's offering of it. And in those moments, they touch something that feels almost like grace, almost like the kind of spiritual love that religious traditions speak of. Or the empath creates meaning from suffering, transforms pain into growth, finds beauty in brokenness. And the narcissist, who typically experiences suffering only as narcissistic injury to be defended against, can witness through the empath that there's another way to hold pain, a way that's actually spiritually generative rather than just destructive. The empath is showing them constantly what it looks like to be spiritually alive, what it looks like to access dimensions of human experience that the narcissist's pathology has cut them off from. And through this witnessing, through this proximity, the narcissist has a kind of borrowed spiritual life. They're not doing the inner work that would create genuine spiritual capacity, but they're close enough to someone who has done that work that they can experience its fruits indirectly. This is why the relationship with the empath often feels different to the narcissist than other relationships. It's not just that the empath provides superior supply, though they do. It's that they provide access to something the narcissist has no other way of touching. The spiritual richness of genuine human depth, authentic love, transcendent meaning. But here's the devastating spiritual consequence when the empath leaves that portal closes. Suddenly, completely, the narcissist's only connection to divine experience is severed. They're back in the spiritual desert they've always inhabited, but now with the consciousness of what they've lost. They know what it felt like to be near someone who could access spiritual depth, who could generate genuine love, who could transform ordinary moments into something sacred through the quality of their presence and attention. They've tasted that proximity to the divine, even if it was always borrowed, always secondhand. And now it's gone. The empath has taken their spiritual aliveness with them, and the narcissist is left in isolation that's not just emotional or psychological, but fundamentally spiritual. They're cut off from the very dimensions of human experience that make life feel meaningful, that connect us to something larger than our small, defended selves. This is a loss that operates at a different register than anything we've discussed psychologically. It's not just loneliness or the absence of supply. It's spiritual isolation of the most profound kind, being aware that there are depths of experience, dimensions of love and meaning and beauty that you cannot access on your own and no longer have access to through another. When your only brig to the sacred was another person's soul, their departure doesn't just leave you alone, it leaves you exiled from the divine itself. Now, to understand what happens spiritually when the narcissist loses the empath, we need to talk about light and shadow, not in some abstract metaphorical sense, but as real forces in the spiritual economy of human relationships. The empath carries a particular quality of light. This isn't just warmth or kindness, though it includes those things. It's a spiritual radiance that comes from their capacity to remain open-hearted despite pain, to choose love despite fear, to maintain connection to something transcendent even in the midst of darkness. The empath's presence literally illuminates the spaces they occupy. People feel it. The narcissist certainly feels it. And here's what's crucial to understand. In the empath's presence, the narcissist could bask in that light without having to generate their own. They could exist in proximity to spiritual depth, to genuine love, to transcendent meaning, without doing any of the internal work required to access these states themselves. The empath's light was bright enough, sustained enough, that it created the illusion that the narcissist too was capable of dwelling in that luminous space. Think about what this meant for the narcissist on a daily, lived level. In the empath's presence, they could experience moments of beauty, connection, even something approaching grace. The empath's capacity for wonder made ordinary moments feel meaningful. Their depth of feeling created the impression of shared spiritual experience. Their forgiveness and compassion allowed the narcissist to maintain the fantasy that they too were fundamentally good, fundamentally capable of love. The empath's light was so bright that it cast the narcissist's shadow behind them, out of view, easy to deny. As long as the empath remained present, radiating that spiritual luminosity, the narcissist didn't have to confront the darkness within themselves. They could position themselves in the empath's glow and mistake reflected light for their own inner radiance. But then the empath leaves, and this is where the spiritual consequences become devastating. Because when that sustaining light withdraws, when the empath's presence is no longer there to illuminate and obscure simultaneously, the narcissist is suddenly knitted with their own shadow in a way they've been successfully avoiding. The darkness they've been fleeing, the spiritual emptiness they've been denying, the void where authentic spiritual presence should be, all of it becomes visible in the absence of the empath's light. This isn't a gradual realization. It's often experienced as a kind of spiritual crisis, a sudden plunge into darkness that feels catastrophic. The narcissist has been living in borrowed light for so long that they've forgotten, or never knew, what their own internal landscape actually looks like. And what they discover in the empath's absence is terrifying. There's nothing there. No inner light to sustain them. No spiritual core to return to. Just emptiness, shadow, the accumulated darkness of years or decades of spiritual bypassing and emotional dishonesty. The contrast is what makes this unbearable. If the narcissist had never experienced the empath's light, they might remain comfortable in their darkness, unaware that anything else was possible. But they've tasted what it's like to exist in proximity to genuine spiritual presence. They've experienced what love, depth, meaning, and transcendence feel like, even if they were only ever borrowing these experiences rather than generating them. And now they're back in the dark, but with the consciousness of what light feels like, with the memory of spiritual warmth, with the excruciating awareness of what they've lost and what they've never actually possessed within themselves. This is a particular kind of spiritual suffering that's almost impossible to articulate or remedy, because the narcissist cannot return to unconscious darkness. They've seen the light, but they also cannot access their own inner light because they've done none of the work required to develop it. They've spent years, perhaps a lifetime, constructing defenses against the very vulnerability and self-honesty that spiritual development requires. So they're trapped, aware of the light, but unable to generate it, conscious of the darkness, but unwilling to do the shadow work that would integrate it. They know what they're missing, but they can't access it through their own resources, and the person who provided access is gone. The empath's departure forces the narcissist into a confrontation with their own spiritual bankruptcy, and this confrontation is so painful, so threatening to their entire defensive structure that the narcissist typically responds in one of two ways. They either plunge deeper into denial, frantically seeking new sources of borrowed light to avoid facing their own darkness, or they spiral into a kind of spiritual despair that masquerades as depression, but is actually the soul's protest against its own abandonment. Neither response leads to healing because both are still avoiding the fundamental spiritual work that the narcissist needs, turning toward their own shadow, sitting with their own darkness, doing the excruciating internal labor of developing their own light from the inside out. The empath's presence had allowed them to avoid this work indefinitely. The empath's absence makes it unavoidable. And the narcissist, faced with this spiritual reckoning, almost always chooses continued avoidance over authentic transformation, because the transformation would require everything they've spent their life defending against. Vulnerability, honesty, the dismantling of the false self, the integration of disowned parts. So the darkness that the empath's light had been obscuring doesn't just remain. It intensifies. Because now it's darkness with awareness, emptiness with memory of fullness, spiritual poverty with the knowledge of what wealth feels like. The narcissist is spiritually impoverished in a way they can no longer deny, and that awareness, without the willingness to do anything about it, becomes its own form of torment. When the light that obscured your darkness withdraws, finally see what you've been fleeing, and the seeing changes nothing if you still refuse to heal. But the spiritual consequences of losing the empath go beyond confrontation with inner darkness, because there's something else happening at a level that's more fundamental than psychology, something that operates according to spiritual laws that exist whether we acknowledge them or not. And that's the principle of karmic return, the universal tendency toward balance, reciprocity, and consequence. Now, I want to be careful here, because karma is often misunderstood as some kind of cosmic punishment system, divine retribution for wrongdoing. That's not what I'm talking about. Karma, in its true sense, is simply the law of cause and effect operating at the level of energy, intention, and action. What you put out into the world creates ripples that eventually return to you, not because the universe is judging you, but because that's simply how energy works. The narcissist has been operating for years, perhaps their entire life, in ways that create harm. They manipulate, they deceive, they take without giving, they damage others to protect their own fragile ego. And all of this creates karmic debt, energetic imbalance that seeks resolution, consequences that naturally flow from harmful actions. But here's what the empath was doing, often without consciously realizing it. They were absorbing and buffering those consequences. They were taking the impact of the narcissist's harmful behavior and transforming it through their own capacity for forgiveness, understanding, and unconditional love. They were essentially standing between the narcissist and the natural return of their own destructive energy. Think about what this looks like practically. When the narcissist lied, the empath believed them, sparing them the consequence of lost trust. When the narcissist raged, the empath absorbed it without retaliating, preventing the natural escalation that rage typically produces. When the narcissist betrayed, the empath forgave, again and again, delaying the abandonment that betrayal normally ensures. When the narcissist caused harm, the empath made excuses for them, protected their reputation, prevented others from seeing the full extent of their destructiveness. The empath was functioning as a kind of karmic shock absorber, taking the impact of consequences that should have naturally returned to the narcissist and transforming them into something softer, something survivable, something the narcissist could continue to ignore. This wasn't healthy for the empath. We understand that now. But spiritually, it served a function for the narcissist. It allowed them to continue their destructive patterns without experiencing the full weight of natural consequences. It delayed the universe's tendency toward balance. It created a protective buffer around the narcissist that insulated them from the energetic return of their own actions. But when the empath leaves, when they finally choose themselves and walk away, this buffer disappears. And what often happens next is what I call karmic acceleration. Suddenly, all those delayed consequences, all that accumulated energetic debt, all the natural returns that the empath had been absorbing or deflecting, they begin to manifest with startling rapidity. You'll often see this as a cascade of external events in the narcissist's life. Relationships that they thought were stable suddenly collapse. Professional situations that seemed secure unravel. People who had tolerated them for years suddenly set boundaries or walk away. Secrets they thought were safely hidden come to light. Lies they thought they'd successfully maintained are exposed. The house of cards they've been building begins to fall, and it falls quickly. And from the outside, this might look like coincidence or bad luck. The narcissists themselves will certainly frame it that way. They're the victim of circumstances, of other people's dysfunction, of an unfair universe. But what's actually happening is that natural consequences are finally being allowed to complete their cycle. The empath's departure often marks an inflection point where the spiritual protection they'd been unknowingly providing is withdrawn, and the narcissist must finally face the accumulated weight of their own choices. It's not punishment. It's simply the restoration of natural balance, the universe correcting an imbalance that the empath's presence had been maintaining. This is why the period after losing an empath is often particularly chaotic and destructive for the narcissist. It's not just the loss of one person, one relationship. It's the removal of a spiritual buffer that was protecting them from the natural consequences of their own behavior across all areas of their life. And here's what's particularly significant. The narcissist had opportunities throughout the relationship to change course, to choose growth over defense, to transform the pattern before consequences accumulated to this degree. The empath was offering not just love, but the possibility of redemption, the chance to break destructive patterns in an environment of radical acceptance. Every time the empath forgave, it was an invitation. You could choose differently. You could heal. I'm creating space for that. But the narcissist refused those invitations again and again. They mistook the empath's grace for permission to continue unchanged. They interpreted patience as proof they didn't need to transform. They used the empath's unconditional love as a license for conditional behavior. So when the empath leaves, they're not just withdrawing their personal presence, they're withdrawing the spiritual grace period they'd been extending. And the karmic consequences that had been delayed by that grace now arrive, often with compounding force. This isn't about the universe being cruel or vindictive. It's about the natural completion of cycles that had been artificially interrupted. Energy seeks balance. Actions seek consequences. Harm seeks resolution. The empath had been interrupting these natural movements through their own spiritual capacity, but that interruption was never going to be permanent. There's something profoundly just about this. Even though it's painful to witness, the narcissist spent years or decades avoiding accountability, denying impact, escaping consequences through manipulation, and the empath's absorption of harm. But spiritual law is not ultimately escapable through psychological defense mechanisms. What you send out returns. The harm you cause creates ripples. The balance you disturb seeks restoration. And when the empath, who had been maintaining an artificial equilibrium through their own depletion, finally stops, the natural tendency toward balance reasserts itself with a calm, elated force. The narcissist often experiences this as persecution, as the universe turning against them, as everyone suddenly mistreating them. But what they're actually experiencing is simply the removal of extraordinary grace they never earned and the arrival of ordinary consequences they've always deserved. Grace delayed the reckoning, but grace withdrawn cannot prevent it. What you've sown finally comes to harvest when the one who shielded you chooses to stop. But beyond the karmic consequences and the confrontation with darkness, there's another spiritual dimension to what happens when the narcissist loses the empath. And this one speaks to something even more fundamental about the nature of the soul and its trajectory through this life. From a spiritual perspective, we're not just moving through life accumulating experiences. We're here for soul growth, for evolution, for the expansion of consciousness through the friction of human relationship. And certain relationships arrive in our lives not by accident, but as profound spiritual opportunities, chances to heal ancient wounds, to break destructive patterns, to become more fully ourselves. The empath represented exactly the kind of opportunity for the narcissist. Not just a relationship, but a sacred chance for transformation that most people never receive. Think about what was actually being offered here. The empath had the rare capacity to see the narcissist wound, the core trauma, the defended vulnerability, the fractured child underneath the grandiose facade, and still remain present, still offer love, still hold space for the possibility of healing. This is extraordinarily rare. Most people either can't see through the narcissist's defenses, or if they can They lack the depth or resilience to stay once they've seen what's there. But the empath could do both. They could perceive the wound and they could hold it with compassion. They could see the narcissist's destructive patterns and still believe in their capacity for something different. They could witness the narcissist at their worst and still maintain faith in their potential for healing. From a spiritual standpoint, this represents an almost unprecedented opportunity for soul growth. The empath was essentially offering the narcissist a chance to be seen completely. Defenses and all, wound and all, pathology and all, and to discover that being seen doesn't have to mean being destroyed. That vulnerability doesn't have to lead to abandonment. That the authentic self underneath all the protection might actually be worthy of love. This is the kind of mirror that could facilitate genuine transformation. The empath wasn't just reflecting back the narcissist's grandiose false self the way most supply sources do. They were reflecting the true self with enough compassion and steadiness that healing might actually become possible. They were creating the conditions where the narcissist could, if they chose, begin to dismantle their defenses and integrate their dissound parts. This is soul work of the deepest kind. This is the opportunity that lifetimes are built around, the chance to heal core wounds in the presence of someone who can hold both your shadow and your light without flinching. And the narcissist refused it. Not once, but repeatedly. Every time the empath offered genuine intimacy, the narcissist chose defense. Every time the empath invited vulnerability, the narcissist chose control. Every time the empath created space for transformation, the narcissist filled it with manipulation, devaluation, or distraction. They didn't just reject the empath, they rejected their own soul's opportunity for evolution. They betrayed not just a person, but a sacred chance for growth that may never come again in quite this form. Because here's the spiritual reality: opportunities, this profound, are finite. The universe offers us chances for healing, but it doesn't offer them indefinitely. When we consistently refuse the invitation to grow, when we betray the relationships that could facilitate our transformation, we're not just maintaining the status quo. We're actively foreclosing possibilities for evolution. The narcissist's soul, which might have expanded through the friction and grace of genuine love with the empath, instead contracts. It pulls further back into defended isolation, becomes more rigid, more fortified, more committed to the very patterns that keep it imprisoned. What could have been a catalyst for liberation becomes instead confirmation that love is dangerous, that vulnerability leads to annihilation, that the only safety lies in continued defense. This is spiritual regression masquerading as self-protection. The narcissist believes they're surviving, maintaining control, protecting themselves. But from the soul's perspective, they're choosing stagnation over growth, contraction over expansion, imprisonment over liberation. And the tragedy is that the narcissist will likely never receive another opportunity quite like this. They might encounter other empaths, other people with depth and capacity for unconditional love. That specific configuration, that particular person who could see their specific wound and hold their particular pathology with exactly the kind of compassion that might have facilitated healing. That was unique. That was a one-time spiritual offering. By betraying it, the narcissist hasn't just lost a relationship. They've foreclosed a path toward wholeness that existed in potential, but will never be actualized. Their soul, instead of evolving through the challenge and gift of being truly loved, remains frozen in the defensive posture it's held for years or decades. There's a concept in spiritual traditions of the sacred wound. The idea that our deepest injuries can become portals to our greatest healing if we're willing to turn toward them rather than away. The empath was essentially offering to guide the narcissist through that portal, to walk with them into the wound so it could finally be integrated and healed. But crossing that threshold would have required everything the narcissist's defenses exist to prevent: honesty about their impact on others, willingness to feel shame and guilt, surrender of the grandiose self-image, acknowledgement of vulnerability and need. It would have required a kind of ego death that feels to the narcissist like actual death. So they chose the death they know, the slow spiritual death of continued defense, isolation, and disconnection, over the temporary death of the ego that could have led to resurrection of the authentic self. And now that the empath is gone, that opportunity for soul growth is gone with them. The narcissist is left with their defended self intact, their patterns unchanged, their soul no closer to wholeness than it was before the relationship began. In fact, arguably further from it, because now they carry the additional spiritual weight of having been offered transformation and having actively betrayed it. This soul doesn't forget these refusals. They accumulate as a kind of spiritual scar tissue, making each subsequent opportunity for growth harder to recognize and accept. The narcissist becomes increasingly entrenched in their pathology, increasingly identified with their defenses, increasingly disconnected from the authentic self that might have emerged if they'd had the courage to risk transformation. You can refuse the soul's invitation to grow, but you cannot refuse the consequences of that refusal. You become exactly what you've defended, and the path not taken becomes the road you can no longer find. And finally, we arrive at perhaps the most existentially disorienting spiritual consequence of the narcissist losing the empath, something that creates a particular kind of spiritual homelessness that's almost impossible to articulate, but devastating to experience. The empath, you see, wasn't just providing love or validation or even spiritual buffering. At a more fundamental level, they were serving as an anchor, a tether to the human experience of meaning, connection, and authentic emotional reality. They were the narcissist's point of contact with what it means to be genuinely alive in a human body, in human relationship, in the flow of real feeling and real presence. And when that anchor is severed, the narcissist enters a liminal, spiritual space that's neither here nor there. They become untethered, floating in a kind of spiritual void that has no coordinates, no reference points, no sense of solid ground. Try to explain what this looks like from the inside, because it's a state that's profoundly disorienting, even though it might appear from the outside as if the narcissist is simply continuing their life unchanged. The narcissist has always existed in a kind of spiritual twilight, not fully present in authentic human connection, because that would require too much vulnerability, but not fully embraced in their shadow either, because that would require confronting truths they've spent a lifetime avoiding. They've been suspended between worlds, aware that something is missing but unable to access it, conscious of a void but unwilling to fill it through genuine inner work. The empath's presence allowed this suspended state to feel somewhat stable. The empath was a bridge to the world of authentic feeling, genuine connection, real love. Through the empath, the narcissist could touch these experiences peripherally, could remain adjacent to the human world of meaning and depth without actually having to fully inhabit it themselves. It's like standing at the edge of a warm, lit room on a cold night. You're not inside where it's truly warm, but you can feel the heat through the doorway, can see the light, can catch glimpses of what's happening in there. You're not fully outside, in the cold darkness either. You're in the threshold, benefiting from proximity without committing to entry. The empath was that threshold. They kept the door open. They maintained the narcissist's connection, however tenuous, to the world of authentic human experience. But when the empath leaves, they close that door. And suddenly the narcissist finds themselves outside, in the cold, with no way back in. They're no longer adjacent to genuine connection. They're exiled from it. They can't access authentic love because they never developed the capacity for it themselves. They were always borrowing access through the empath. But here's what makes this particularly torturous. They can't fully retreat into their defended isolation either because they've now experienced what warmth feels like. They've tasted genuine connection, even if they were only ever touching it through another person. They know what they're missing in a way they didn't before the empath arrived. So they're stuck in this unbearable in-between state, too aware of what authentic connection feels like to be comfortable in complete isolation, but too defended and underdeveloped spiritually to access that connection through their own resources, too conscious of the light to remain peacefully in darkness, but too terrified of vulnerability to do the work that would generate their own inner light. This creates a kind of spiritual wandering, a restless, searching quality that has no resolution. The narcissist moves from person to person, experience to experience, trying to find their way back to that threshold state, trying to recreate the conditions where they felt tethered to something real. But they can't find it because what they're looking for isn't a person or an experience. It's a quality of presence and spiritual depth that the empath embodied, but that no replacement can replicate. They're seeking someone to serve as anchor again, someone to stand in that doorway and let them feel the warmth of authentic connection without having to step fully inside. But even when they find empathic people, it doesn't work the same way. Because the new person hasn't yet absorbed years of the narcissist's projections, hasn't yet learned to translate their unspoken needs, hasn't yet developed that particular attunement that made the original empath so effective at bridging the narcissist's isolation. And the narcissist can't explain what they're looking for because they don't understand it themselves. They just know that something essential is missing, that they're floating unmoored, that nothing feels solid or real or meaningful anymore. They might describe it as depression, as existential crisis, as a sense that life has lost its color or significance. But what they're actually experiencing is spiritual homelessness, the loss of their anchor to the human world of authentic connection. This untethered state often manifests as increasing instability in all areas of the narcissist's life. Without the empath's grounding presence, their behavior becomes more erratic, their choice is more self-destructive, their relationships more chaotic. They're no longer stabilized by someone who could absorb their volatility and reflect back coherence. They're free, floating in their own dysregulation with no one to contain it. There's also a quality of spiritual searching that emerges, but it's searching without the willingness to actually find. The narcissist might suddenly become interested in spirituality, in meditation, in healing modalities. They might talk about awakening or transformation. But watch closely, and you'll see they're not actually doing the work. They're performing spiritual seeking while avoiding the vulnerability that genuine spiritual development requires. They want the result, the sense of meaning, the feeling of connection, the experience of inner peace without the process. They want to arrive at wholeness with traveling through the territory of shadow integration and ego dissolution that wholeness requires. So they remain in perpetual seeking, perpetual dissatisfaction, perpetually looking for something external to fill an internal void. The empath's departure has left them spiritually homeless, unable to return to unconscious defense, unable to move forward into conscious healing, stuck in an awareness of what's missing without the capacity or willingness to cultivate it within themselves. They're wandering between worlds, belonging to neither, increasingly desperate for an anchor they'll never find in another person because the anchor they need can only be developed internally. And that's the final spiritual consequence. The narcissist must now live with the consciousness of their own spiritual poverty while remaining committed to the defenses that ensure it continues, aware of the homelessness, but unwilling to build a home within. When you lose your tether to what's real and refuse to anchor yourself, you don't float free. You drift endlessly, seeking a ground you'll never find in another.